Hello friends! In this video we're going to take an in-depth look at subwoofers. We're going to look at how they're designed, how they work, the different types that are out there. So to start with, this is a Bose Acoustimass module, they call it. I took this apart in a previous video. It originally had an amplifier and other associated signal processing circuitry to allow it to be used as a primary stereo system. So basically this box would replace something like a stereo receiver with a separate control module. With all the guts stripped out of it, this makes a pretty good example of a basic subwoofer design, which is all that's left in this unit. So let's turn around and see what's inside. With this turned around and set down on its side, you can see the basic elements that we have here. The most obvious one is the driver. We've got an acoustic port here, and we've also got a heavy box that's made out of particle board. Particle board is a typical construction material for speakers because it's inexpensive and also has the right physical properties. In particular, it's dense, pretty durable, and can easily be shaped to whatever is needed. One thing you notice immediately if you've looked at a lot of speaker drivers about this subwoofer driver is that it's a relatively small surface compared to a large size magnet. Now for comparison, here's another speaker that I had on the shelf. This is 5 watts, 8 ohms. It's about 8 inches maybe. The magnet is smaller even though the cone is bigger on the other speaker. So what's going on here is the box itself provides an acoustic environment where the speaker driver can move a lot of air with a lot of power, because within the box there's in effect resistance to the air moving that by the time it comes out of the box is back into the normal air pressure environment. So running this by itself in, let's say, just a flat panel setup like maybe a guitar amplifier would have wouldn't make any sense, because this speaker diaphragm here is not big enough to push enough air to go with the size of this magnet. You can make a guess about the power output of a speaker driver based on its magnet size. So this one I've used as my other example is 5 watts. So as a guess, maybe this is 10 or 15 or 20 watts since it's a bigger magnet. There's a panel in the middle of this about here. There's open space here. Around this ridge some air gets in, and the primary acoustic output is this port down here. Below this doesn't have any importance. These are basically just legs on the unit. The speaker driver itself is placed about here, and if you think about that, the front of the speaker driver isn't actually facing the outside whatsoever. But what it's working with is some sort of combined effect of this port, which is where the sound really comes out. There's this cavity in front of the speaker driver, and then there's this porting hole that connects the back cavity to the front cavity. Now on this unit I've got the back sawed off, whereas originally this was a completely enclosed area, meaning that all the air that moves around inside here from the back side of the speaker is going to end up working its way through this port towards the front. And the physical dimensions of this are set up as part of the speaker design where basically the frequency range that this is designed to work for is all the physics of the size and dimensions and materials are all designed by the Bose people to be work together so that you can deliver the maximum acoustic power that this speaker provides through this acoustic port on the front. So as this stands, it's relatively useless except as a display item. It needs to have a power amplifier to drive the speaker. It needs to have a crossover or possibly be provided by externally, such as by a subwoofer output of an AV receiver. And we also need to close up the back of this. So I'm going to try to rehabilitate this in a future project, so watch for that. But for right now, it makes a very nice demo unit of the basic construction of a subwoofer. Now that I've showed you the construction of a basic subwoofer, we're going to look at the types of subwoofers that are out there. They're generally the same in terms of providing a frequency response of, let's say, below 100 Hertz. There might be a little bit of overlap with what a large bass reflex speaker would do. But this one is a Sony. I got this at a thrift store for $6.99. These are fairly easy to find at thrift stores. They're inexpensive. This is a particularly good price, but you might be able to get one for $10 or $20. And this is what I'd call an unpowered subwoofer. This has a rated impedance of 1.5 ohms. So you would generally want to connect this to a special subwoofer powered output. Kind of a standard speaker impedance is 8 ohms. This one I measured at about 2 ohms. So I'm kind of thinking that subwoofers typically have an impedance of 2 ohms. Now, just looking at these two, they're actually quite similar. This one's slightly bigger, of course, but here's the powered driver element behind the screen. I can't take this one apart without destroying it, which it's not a project, it's one to actually use somewhere. We've got a port here that's similar to this port. This screen is probably similar to this vent area underneath this ridge that's kind of hard to see. The driver element is about in this position, same here. So the way to evaluate these things is on their features and their basic size. Since the Bose originally came with its own driver electronics, that was a plus in its era, but it turned out the controller for it was more expensive than I wanted to pay on eBay, so I ended up scrapping the whole thing. It was really kind of a project anyway. I paid $10 for this. Recommend you check out the video on that if you're interested. But you can see that the box is approximately the same size here, a little bit bigger. We've also got particle board construction. And generally speaking, a quality subwoofer is going to be in a heavy box with approximately this size. So as a guess, this is maybe 18 inches by 10 inches and by 12. So this is a nice find as a subwoofer goes, except that it's only part of the story, because an AV receiver like this one typically produces a line level output for subwoofers. So you're going to need some sort of amplifier to hook this subwoofer to this AV receiver or others like it. The next subwoofer we're going to look at is a theater research unit. This is kind of a no-name brand. When I looked at it for it on the internet, it kind of was pretty hard to find. We got these cheesy looking silver cones here. There's two of them that are pretty large. I think this is an older unit from maybe 20 years ago that my brother found in an auction. Turn the Theater Research subwoofer around. You can see one design difference is the porting holes on the back. That's not really a concern. So one thing to bear in mind about subwoofers is where the sound comes from and where the unit is placed in your room isn't really that important. The reason is that the low frequencies that they emit, your ears are not able to detect in a directional sense anyway. So basically volume is what counts as far as subwoofers go. Now this one is different than the other two that we've seen. You can use this with any stereo amplifier because it includes its own crossover unit. So this one you put in 2 stereo speaker channels, and it's got outputs for 2 non-subwoofer speakers, like a standard bass reflex speaker. They've even given us some specs here. So I'm going to assume this is kind of typical for what subwoofer specs are, 40 Hz to 180 Hz. The range of human hearing is kind of generally considered as a rule of thumb to be 20 Hz to 20 kilohertz. So we've almost covered that. 40 Hz sounds like a big difference factor of 2, but you rarely get that low. This one goes to about 180 Hertz on the subwoofer part. Now satellites, which is the outputs that it makes through its crossover network, 100 Hertz to 20 kilohertz, and they're saying 4.8 ohms. You'd like to have 8 ohms, but that's okay. So from a sort of an audiophile point of view, you wouldn't want to use this because of the fact that the crossover in here is going to color the frequency response of the overall system on the satellite speakers or the separate speakers. Now for a home theater purpose where you're not really necessarily interested in the very finest symphonic sound quality, but just kind of something that sounds good on a movie, this might be a perfectly adequate way to go. I haven't been seeing this type in thrift stores lately. I think the next type that we're going to see, which is the powered subwoofer, is probably taken over in those cases. Our next category of subwoofer is the powered subwoofer. And what powered means is that it has its own built-in subwoofer amplifier. So this is one I picked up at the thrift store recently for $12. It's sharper image. Who knows what's actually inside there as far as electronics goes. But I've tried it out in another video, and I'm happy with it for what it is. This one is kind of deluxe in the way of powered subwoofers, at least as far as features go. You can put in the line level input that you normally see on an AV receiver. You can put in true speaker inputs. They call this speaker level. If you're not working with an AV receiver, if you're working with an older unit such as an old conventional stereo that isn't an AV receiver. Since this is powered, we have a AC power going in, power switch, and a volume control, which is handy to adjust the overall volume of this. And this is kind of portable and easy to carry around. So I'm thinking I may use this in my living room as kind of a way to improve the sound, or I may use it in my little lab area here in the basement to kind of, do other testing with. So this is not a champion, as you can kind of tell immediately by the physical dimensions. Plastic construction, But as far as features and powered subwoofer, and if you're not expecting a lot of performance, this is actually pretty good. It does hum a little bit. But the way this one works is right under here you can feel the speaker element, and then this gap and an equal one in the front are conveying the sound. I don't see any other porting on this, so I'm not sure if there is any. Actually, oh, okay. I've never looked at the bottom of this before, so we'll learn this together. So this is their design. This is the driver element, and this is the porting hole. So that kind of explains why they've got these kind of air gaps here. Once you set this down, you've got sound coming from the face of the speaker as well as from the porting hole, and that's consistent with what we've seen in other cases, like such going back to the Bose. The sound from the face of the speaker more or less comes out of this little vent slot here, and this is the porting hole. So what you wouldn't have is a totally enclosed area, because that doesn't allow the speaker element to push against and move a larger air mass in and out. If you had this closed in, it would basically be pretty quiet. So based on the speaker size, this says 32 watts as far as AC input goes. So let's say, you know, this may be a 5-watt subwoofer as far as audio power goes. This is not a champ, which you can tell by the physical dimensions and the plastic construction. But, you know, for $12, this kind of thing at a thrift store is probably worth picking up for a secondary use. Next, we got this Polk audio unit. This is a subwoofer that came with a Polk audio soundbar that I got at a thrift store. This ended up being sold separately for $12. We know this is powered because it has an AC power cord and an on-off switch. We've got some specs here. 50 watts for the unit. That's the AC power coming in. On the bottom, you'll notice the same theme. We've got an air gap around these kind of feet that are built in. Lucy, want to be in my video? Can you say hello for the camera? Lucy has her own video channel, by the way. I recommend you check that out. So here we've got the driver element, porting hole. This is all looking familiar. And just for comparison, let's flip this one up and show. So based on the larger dimensions, we can reasonably guess that this is a little higher powered unit, maybe derating the 50 watts of AC power. This might be 10 watts of audio power. You can see the driver unit here. This is larger. Porting hole is larger. Probably the volume inside the box is larger. So generally speaking, you can say this is a more powerful unit. Polk is one of the premium speaker brands, but in the soundbar market, it's more or less a high-end soundbar at this point. It's not any kind of audiophile champion. And one thing to notice about this in particular compared to the other one, this is designed as an add-on for whatever stereo system you might have. So with this as a dedicated subwoofer for a soundbar, it actually has no inputs that we can see, and we can reasonably guess that this uses some sort of RF input, might be Bluetooth, to communicate between the soundbar and the subwoofer. So as this stands without the matching soundbar, this is basically useless. But what I'm planning to do in a future video is to pull this apart and find out where I can tap in to turn this into a powered subwoofer. This is an Altec Lansing subwoofer, or probably woofer even, meaning that it goes to a higher frequency range. I believe this is part of a computer speaker system, so we're not expecting a lot of high fidelity and power out of this, but I got it for $3 and just couldn't pass it up. So here the venting appears to be on the bottom. It's hard to see through here, but there's a speaker driver about this size underneath. These are more venting holes at the back. I suspect there's one of these circular ports inside here somewhere. This has a captive power cord, left, right, and input. So I'm going to need to do some sort of modification on this to use it as is, because typically with this type of computer speaker you've got a volume control or something that goes through one of the elements. So as a guess, it would be maybe shorting a couple of these connectors or putting a volume pot between them and then putting input here, and this might also have some sort of power switch relay that it needs. So this one is kind of analogous to the Polk in the sense that it's not usable standalone, but it does have a specific input and outputs that'll probably be pretty easy to trace around. With the Polk, I'm going to need to sort of figure out where the RF stops and where the audio begins to tap in at the right point. So this is another one that I hope to take apart in a future video series. Next we have this Klipsch THX subwoofer. You can see the porting hole right away. Klipsch is a high-end brand, maybe more so than Polk even. I picked this up for $12, I believe. It's noticeably heavier than the last two that I've shown you. I think this has a pretty big power amplifier in it. And this one is a little different, that it's designed for sort of a all-in-one home theater application. I was hopeful based on the brand that this was worth something, but it turns out a whole system, including the satellite speakers that I'm missing, is about $50 on eBay. So at $12, this is an okay buy, but it's not any kind of great score. So if we look at the back of this, it has satellite speaker outputs. From the heaviness of it, I'm pretty sure it's got a pretty beefy power supply and transformer in it. On-off switch, fuse, that's a good sign of quality. But it has this goofy connector that I'm not interested in and don't have a mate for. So honestly, that's going to be a matter of pulling it apart and tapping in at the right parts on the other side of this connector. You know, maybe drill a hole for the whatever, or replace the connector with something that makes sense to me. This one also, from a cosmetic standpoint, it has this plastic decal type stuff is peeling off, so that doesn't add to its resale value, but it does let us see that this is the same type of particle board construction that we've been looking at. Now, as another thing to think about with this Klipsch is that the volume of it is basically the same as even this cheap Altec Lansing. It's maybe approximately the same as the Bose, or a little smaller, same as the Polk. So really, volume is kind of the name of the game on these things. After a rigid construction and some sort of intelligent sound design around the porting, there's a lot of science involved in making these ports work as design. So that's a, if you want to make your own, that's either a pretty advanced hobbyist project, or else you know, do what I do and visit your local thrift store. Now, aside from the port on what appears to be the front based on the name plate, we've got the speaker itself on the side. So here's the actual model name, Pro Media 2.1. Our power rating for the AC input is 240 watts. So let's say this can drive, you know, 100 watts of total power, which makes sense with the heaviness of it. When we look at this in a future video, I'm expecting to find a very big transformer inside. And also, I think the use case on this klipsch is maybe for a high-end PC gamer system. Maybe if you've got a discriminating gamer that spent thousands on the gaming PC, he doesn't mind spending $500 or whatever this originally cost on a fancy klipsch sound system. Now, last and actually least is this little computer speaker system. I bought this new, I don't know, 10 years ago. Probably cost something like $30. They call this piece a subwoofer, but it's actually a woofer. And again, we see the driver element and a port, and the feet allow an air gap for that air to move around. This is probably the satellite type units that we would expect to see on the klipsch. And I realized as I pulled this out to film it that this cable might actually go on here. So let's try that. And it does. So I don't know if these type of so-called computer speakers have a standardized cable, but it might be that I can reuse some of the pieces from this unit to go with the klipsch. I know that these little tweeters, or whatever you would call them, are quite terrible. This is basically e-waste at this point. But I may be able to reuse the cables and things. We'll just do a quick tour of the ones we've already seen. The Bose Theater Research, Sony klipsch. Got Polk over in the corner. This is the Altec Lansing. So obviously don't need all of these, but the Bose is a future project to build up using an amplifier that I salvaged someplace. And I may be able to rehabilitate the klipsch into a nice unit for my living room subwoofer. So I hope you've enjoyed our tour. If so, please help me out by giving me a like and subscribe, and also hit that notification button so that you'll be notified of my future efforts, including as I take apart some of these other units. Thanks, and bye-bye.